The rain did not just fall against the neon-lit windows of the highway diner. It hammered against the metal roof with the deafening roar of a low-flying jet engine. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee, maple syrup, and the faint, unmistakable scent of aviation fuel drifting from the private airstrip across the dark asphalt of Route 9. Wyatt Carter wiped down the laminate counter with a slow, rhythmic motion that masked the absolute precision of his movements. To anyone looking through the storm, he was just a 29-year-old single father running a forgotten 24-hour diner in a town called Blackwood Ridge. They saw a man in a faded apron with calloused hands and a quiet disposition. They did not see the hidden scars beneath his sleeves from high-G flight suits, or the sharp, calculating intellect of a man who used to redesign experimental supersonic propulsion systems for the United States Air Force before a single tragic Tuesday shattered his world. 6 years ago, Wyatt had been a legend at the Edwards Test Flight Center, a brilliant aerospace engineer and an elite combat pilot who could stabilize a spinning aircraft when every system failed. But when a reckless driver took his wife Julia from him on a rain-slicked highway, Wyatt walked away from the sky, the millions in military patents, and the prestige. He took his newborn daughter, bought this isolated roadside refuge, and buried his identity. Now, his only priority was the little girl sleeping peacefully in the corner booth. Hannah Carter was 6 years old, a bundle of dark curls and fierce intelligence. She lay curled up under a faded fleece blanket, her cheek resting against a half-finished first-grade math worksheet. Tucked securely under her small arm was Carrot, a ragged stuffed rabbit with a missing button eye. Wyatt paused his cleaning, his gaze softening as he looked at his daughter. Every sacrifice he had made to disappear into this quiet life was justified by the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. The clock above the grill clicked to 11:47 p.m. Suddenly, the heavy front door slammed open, shivering against the wall. A blast of freezing air and drenching rain swept across the floor tiles. Standing in the threshold was a young girl, no older than 15. Her dark clothes were soaked completely through, plastering her hair to her pale forehead. She was shaking violently, her chest heaving as she gripped the doorframe, her wide, panicked eyes darting across the empty diner like a trapped animal looking for an exit. Wyatt didn't startle. He didn't raise his voice. He simply lowered his rag, stepped out from behind the counter, and spoke in a tone so grounded and calm it seemed to cut right through the howling wind outside. "Take a seat by the grill, kiddo. It's warm there." The girl hesitated, her sneakers squeaking loudly on the wet tile as she took a tentative step forward. She looked down at her hands, which were raw and red from the cold. She didn't carry a backpack, a phone, or a coat. She had nothing but the sheer terror radiating off her small frame. "I don't have any money," she whispered, her voice cracking as she huddled near the counter stools. "I didn't ask for any," Wyatt replied softly. He walked over to the beverage station, poured a glass of warm water, and set it on the counter, followed by a plate of fresh, buttered toast he had quietly prepared. "Eat. You're safe here." The girl stared at the food as if it were a trap. For the past 2 hours, Sophia Blake had been running through the dark, muddy backroads of the county, fleeing a life that was suffocating her. She was the daughter of Alexandra Blake, the ruthless billionaire CEO of Apex Global Aerospace, a massive corporate empire that controlled half the defense contracts in the country. To the world, Sophia lived a life of ultimate luxury. To Sophia, it was a gilded prison managed by a mother who viewed her not as a child, but as an asset to be programmed. Sophia grabbed the toast, devouring it in desperate, uneven bites. Wyatt watched her from the periphery, his mind instantly analyzing her posture. She wasn't just a runaway, she was running from someone with immense resources. He recognized the look of a person escaping high-pressure surveillance. "Can I stay here?" Sophia asked, looking up with eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Just for tonight? Until the storm stops?" Wyatt looked toward the corner booth where Hannah slept, then back at the terrified teenager. The rational choice for a business owner was to call the authorities immediately. But Wyatt knew what happened to vulnerable souls when they were forced back into the hands of cold, powerful oppressors. He had seen the military-industrial complex crush people for less. "There's a small room behind the kitchen with a secure cot," Wyatt said, pointing toward the back hallway. "It has a lock on the inside. No one will disturb you. I'll be right here at the counter all night." "Thank you," Sophia choked out, wiping a tear from her cheek. She disappeared down the hallway, the door clicking shut behind her. Wyatt stood alone in the dim light of the diner, the silence returning, save for the persistent hum of the refrigerators. He knew this act of mercy would have consequences, but his moral compass refused to bend. By 3 a.m., the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Wyatt remained awake, slowly sipping a black coffee, keeping his eyes on the dark highway outside. His instincts, honed by years in elite military survival training, told him the calm wouldn't last. He was right. At exactly 4:15 a.m., the pitch-black parking lot was suddenly illuminated by the blinding high-beam headlights of 3 blacked-out luxury SUVs, followed closely by a local police cruiser. The gravel crunched violently outside. Before Wyatt could even set down his coffee mug, the front door of the diner was violently thrown open. 2 uniformed police officers, Officer Hendricks and Officer Torres, strode inside with their hands resting heavily on their utility belts. But it was the woman who walked in behind them that commanded the entire room. Alexandra Blake stepped onto the diner tiles, her pristine designer trench coat completely untouched by the weather. Her eyes were sharp, frozen over with absolute authority, and her face was twisted into an expression of volatile, aristocratic rage. She didn't look at the diner, she looked straight at Wyatt Carter as if he were nothing more than an insect beneath her expensive heels. "Where is my daughter?" Alexandra demanded, her voice cutting through the space like a razor blade. "Officers, arrest this man immediately. He has kidnapped my child." Wyatt did not flinch. He did not raise his hands in a panic or stumble over his words. He simply stood his ground behind the worn laminate counter, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the stainless steel prep station. The raw, explosive fury radiating from Alexandra Blake would have intimidated any ordinary townsperson. But to a man who had stared down failing warning lights while breaking the sound barrier, the billionaire's rage was just noise. "Ma'am, let us handle this," Officer Hendricks said quickly, stepping forward to placate the powerful woman. Hendricks was a veteran of the local force, and he knew exactly how much weight the name Blake carried in this county. Apex Global Aerospace funded the town's infrastructure, the police retirement balls, and the very ground they stood on. He turned his gaze to Wyatt, his expression hardening. "Wyatt, step away from the counter. Hands where we can see them. We received a report of a missing minor, and tracking data from her smart device pinged this exact location before the signal died." "The girl walked in through that door at midnight," Wyatt said, his voice entirely level, completely devoid of fear. "She was soaked to the bone, shivering and exhausted. I gave her a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. If that's a crime in Blackwood Ridge, you can cuff me right now." Alexandra let out a cold, mocking laugh, the sound clicking sharply against the tile floor. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume instantly fighting against the diner's aroma of grease and coffee. "A safe place? Look at this pathetic excuse for a restaurant. You are a line cook living on the margins of a highway, and you expect me to believe you had nothing but pure intentions when you hid my daughter in your back room?" Before Wyatt could answer, a small movement shifted the atmosphere in the room. From the corner booth, little Hannah sat up. She rubbed her eyes, clutching her ragged stuffed rabbit, Carrot, tightly against her chest. Her wide, dark eyes filled with fear as she looked at the uniform officers and the aggressive woman shouting at her father. "Daddy?" Hannah whispered, her voice tiny but completely piercing the heavy tension in the room. Wyatt's demeanor transformed instantly. The rigid military steel in his spine softened just enough as he glanced at his daughter. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart. Everything is fine. Just some grown-up talk." Alexandra's eyes snapped to the little girl, her lips curling into a tight line of aristocratic disdain. "You have a child here? Unbelievable. Officers, look at this environment. This man is running a low-life operation, and he dragged my daughter into his squalor. I want him arrested, and I want his business shut down by morning." Officer Torres, the younger and more observant of the 2 policemen, didn't move immediately to follow Hendricks' lead. He was watching Wyatt. Specifically, he was watching Wyatt's posture. Wyatt wasn't standing like an anxious short-order cook caught in a lie. His feet were planted firmly, his balance centered, his breathing slow and controlled. Torres had served a tour in the Marines, and he recognized the subtle, unmistakable, physical markers of elite military training. This man was dangerous, not out of malice, but out of capability. Suspicion began to bloom in the young officer's mind. There was far more to this diner owner than a faded apron. "Mom, stop it!" The sharp exclamation came from the back hallway. The kitchen door swung open, and Sophia stepped into the dining area. She was wearing Wyatt's oversized gray pullover, the sleeves completely covering her hands. Her face was flushed, her eyes red from crying, but there was a sudden spark of defiance in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. Alexandra went rigid. The volatile anger on her face vanished, instantly replaced by a mask of absolute icy control. She smoothed down her designer coat and took a step toward her daughter, her voice dropping into a tone that was terrifyingly calm. "Sophia Catherine Blake," Alexandra said, each word a measured strike. "You will step away from that man, you will get into the car, and we will handle your rebellious little stunt at home. You have brought enough embarrassment to this family for one night." "He didn't do anything wrong," Sophia yelled, her voice trembling as she stood her ground, refusing to move toward her mother. "I ran away because of you. I walked for miles in the freezing rain, and he was the only person who actually looked at me like I was a human being, instead of a line on your corporate balance sheet." Alexandra didn't flinch at her daughter's pain. Instead, she turned her cold gaze back to Wyatt, a predatory smile touching her lips. "You see what you've done? You've manipulated a confused teenager. Officers, I'm not asking again. Arrest him." Hendricks pulled his handcuffs from his belt, moving toward Wyatt. But before he could take another step, Wyatt shifted his gaze directly into Alexandra's eyes, his voice carrying an icy authority that made even the veteran officer freeze in his tracks. "You can take your daughter home, Miss Blake," Wyatt said softly. "But if you lay one hand on me or my business, you are going to open a door you cannot close." Alexandra Blake's eyes narrowed into icy slits as Wyatt's words hung in the damp air of the diner. She was a woman who dismantled multinational competitors before breakfast, a billionaire whose phone calls could alter stock markets. To have a nameless man in a stained apron threaten her in a roadside diner was a level of insolence she had never encountered. "Officer Hendricks," Alexandra said, her voice dropping into a dangerous ultra-low frequency. "I am not going to ask you again. Arrest this man for child endangerment, or I will ensure the chief of police receives a personal call from my legal department before the sun finishes rising." Hendricks swallowed hard, stepping forward with the handcuffs trembling slightly in his grip. He didn't want to do this, but the sheer financial gravity of the Blake empire was pulling him under. "Wyatt, don't make this difficult," he muttered, reaching out toward Wyatt's shoulder. Before Hendricks's hand could make contact, Sophia took a sharp, ragged breath. The overwhelming pressure of the room, the sight of her mother's suffocating control, and the exhaustion of her midnight flight suddenly collided. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto one of the vinyl counter stools, her hands clawing at her throat as her breathing turned into a terrifying, rapid gasp. She was hyperventilating. Her skin went completely pale, and her eyes rolled backward slightly as she suffocated on her own panic. Alexandra's corporate composure shattered instantly. The cold, ruthless CEO vanished, replaced by a woman paralyzed by total, internal panic. She rushed to Sophia's side, her expensive designer bag dropping heavily to the floor. "Sophia! Sophia! Look at me!" Alexandra commanded, but her voice was cracking, trembling with a rare, raw terror. She grabbed her daughter's shoulders, shaking her slightly. "Stop this. Breathe. Sophia, I am ordering you to breathe right now." But authority could not buy oxygen. Alexandra's hands were shaking violently. She was entirely helpless, completely out of her depth in the face of a real, unscripted human crisis. She looked around the diner with wide, vulnerable eyes, realizing that all her billions and all her power could not calm the frantic beating of her daughter's heart. For the first time in her life, she had absolutely no control. Wyatt moved before anyone else could think. He didn't yell, he didn't panic, he bypassed Officer Hendricks with a smooth, fluid stride that carried an undeniable, grounded strength. He knelt directly in front of Sophia, completely ignoring Alexandra's frantic presence. "Hey," Wyatt said. His voice was a deep, steady anchor, radiating a quiet masculinity that instantly cut through the chaos. "Look at my eyes, Sophia, just my eyes." Sophia's frantic, wandering gaze locked onto Wyatt's steady blue eyes. "You're okay," Wyatt whispered, his hands hovering gently near her shoulders, offering safety without forcing contact. "The air is right here. Match my breathing. In for 4 seconds. Hold it. Let it go. Let it go." From behind the counter, little Hannah walked out quietly. She didn't look at the police or the screaming billionaire. She walked straight to Sophia and gently placed the tattered stuffed rabbit, Carrot, into the teenager's trembling lap. "Carrot helps when the dark is too loud," Hannah said softly. The contrast in the room was staggering. Alexandra stood frozen, a helpless spectator to her own daughter's life, possessing everything material yet completely devoid of emotional peace. Meanwhile, this humble single father, standing in a faded apron, was effortlessly providing absolute emotional security. Slowly, the frantic gasping stopped. Sophia's chest began to rise and fall in perfect synchronization with Wyatt's deep, rhythmic breaths. She gripped the stuffed rabbit tightly, her head leaning forward until it rested against Wyatt's shoulder. She trusted him completely, a stranger she had known for less than 12 hours, far more than the woman who had raised her. Alexandra watched them in absolute, stunned silence. Her hands were still trembling, her chest aching with a complex mixture of intense relief and a bitter, hollow realization. This line cook had just given her daughter something she had never been able to buy. As the tension in the room began to drain, Officer Torres stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Wyatt's right arm. To help Sophia breathe, Wyatt had rolled up the sleeves of his gray shirt, exposing his rugged forearms. Tucked against the inside of Wyatt's wrist was a heavy, scratch-resistant titanium timepiece, an Omega Speedmaster X33 Skywalker. It wasn't a commercial luxury watch. It was a specialized, highly restricted instrument issued exclusively to elite military test pilots and experimental aerospace engineers. But what caught Torres's breath was the faint, laser-engraved serial number on the back casing, accompanied by a faded, distinct tattoo on the underside of Wyatt's forearm, a stealth fighter silhouette enveloped in a lightning bolt. The official insignia of the classified 412th Test Wing. Torres's jaw dropped slightly. He looked from the watch to the stoic profile of the single father, the puzzle pieces suddenly snapping into a terrifyingly grand picture. "Mr. Carter," Torres said, his voice dropping into a tone of sudden, immense respect. "Where did you get that watch?" Wyatt slowly stood up, pulling his sleeve down with a practiced, deliberate motion that completely covered the titanium casing. He looked at Torres, his eyes flashing with a silent warning that told the young officer exactly who he was dealing with. "It was a gift from an old life, officer," Wyatt said quietly. Before Torres could press further, the heavy silence of the diner was interrupted by a low, mechanical thrumming sound vibrating from the window panes. It wasn't the rain. It was the synchronized, heavy thudding of multiple twin-engine military-grade helicopters descending rapidly from the clouds, their spotlight beams slicing through the storm and illuminating the entire diner parking lot in a blinding, white glare. Alexandra looked out the window, her face tightening as she recognized the markings on the aircraft. "My security detail," she whispered, her powerful facade quickly rebuilding itself. She turned back to Wyatt, her eyes cold once more, completely ignoring the emotional breakthrough that had just occurred. "This isn't over. You think a little parlor trick changes who you are? By tomorrow, I will own this land, and you will be packing your bags." Wyatt didn't look at the helicopters. He didn't look at her threats. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, tarnished silver coin encrypted with a microchip, and set it firmly on the counter. "Call your chief of security, Miss Blake," Wyatt said, his voice ringing with a chilling authority. "Show him that coin. Tell him you're standing in front of the man who wrote the flight control source code for his entire fleet." Alexandra Blake looked down at the small, tarnished silver coin resting on the scratched laminate counter. A mocking, razor-thin smile formed on her lips, though her eyes remained entirely cold. She picked it up with two manicured fingers, barely glancing at the intricate microchip embedded in its center. "You think a token from a military surplus store intimidates me?" Alexandra asked, her voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. "You are a short-order cook, Mr. Carter. You flip eggs for truck drivers. The systems controlling my aircraft are proprietary, multi-billion-dollar military defense secrets. To suggest you have any connection to Apex Global Aerospace is not just a lie, it's a delusion." Before Wyatt could answer, the diner's heavy front door warped inward under a massive rush of wind. A large, broad-shouldered man dressed in sterile, black tactical gear strode into the room. His chest piece bore the corporate emblem of Apex Global Security. This was Marcus Vance, a hardened former commander of elite Black Ops retrieval units, now serving as Alexandra's personal chief of protection. He stepped inside with an air of absolute, violent efficiency, his eyes instantly sweeping the room to secure the perimeter. "Miss Blake," Vance said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "The perimeter is secure. The transport vehicles are ready. We need to move the asset immediately. The storm is worsening, and microbursts are developing over the ridge. Excellent, Alexandra said, tossing the silver coin toward him without care. Hand this trash back to the cook, and Vance, ensure his name is flagged with the state licensing board. I want this establishment condemned by noon. Vance caught the coin effortlessly in his gloved hand. He glanced down at it, intending to pocket it or throw it aside. But as his thumb brushed against the specific raised ridges of the laser-etched encryption pattern, his entire body went completely rigid. The air seemed to leave his lungs. He flipped the coin over, staring intensely at the custom serial number and the microscopic signature engraved beneath the chip, a designator reserved for only one person in the history of military aviation engineering. Vance's face completely lost its color. He slowly turned his head, his gaze shifting from the coin to Wyatt Carter. He looked at Wyatt's calm, centered stance, the quiet masculinity of his posture, and the undeniable steel in his eyes. Vance's arms dropped to his sides, the aggressive, tactical posture vanishing instantly, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. "Commander." "Carter?" Vance whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Alexandra frowned, her eyebrows knitting together in sudden irritation. "Vance? What are you doing? Secure my daughter, and let's go." "Ma'am," Vance said, his eyes never leaving Wyatt. "This isn't a short-order cook. This is the chief architect of the Apex 9 flight control matrix. He's the man who designed the automated stabilization source code for the entire United States experimental fleet. He vanished 6 years ago." Before Alexandra could even process the words, before the shock could register on her face, the entire diner was violently shaken by a massive, vibrating shudder. It wasn't the wind. Through the rain-streaked windows, the blinding spotlights of the hovering twin-engine Vanguard security helicopter suddenly began to swing erratically. The deep, rhythmic thrumming of the rotor blades turned into a terrifying, high-pitched, screaming whine. Suddenly, a piercing burst of static erupted from the tactical radio mounted on Vance's chest vest. The frantic, panicked voice of the lead pilot blared out into the quiet diner, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mayday! Mayday! Vanguard 2 experiencing catastrophic system anomaly. Primary flight computer has locked the cyclic control. The automatic stabilization matrix is rejecting manual override. We have a runaway pitch command. We are losing altitude over the parking lot." Through the glass, everyone watched in horror as the multi-million-dollar tactical helicopter began to spin violently in the dark sky, its tail rotor swinging dangerously close to the power lines lining Route 9. The massive downwash of the failing aircraft slammed into the diner, throwing gravel against the windows, causing the old glass to crack and groan under the immense pressure. Inside, the regulars cowered in their booths. Alexandra completely lost her footing as another tremor shook the floor tiles, stumbling back against the counter. Her face twisted into absolute helpless terror as she watched her private aircraft carrying her top corporate personnel descend rapidly toward a fiery crash. "Vance, do something!" Alexandra screamed, her voice cracking as she gripped his tactical vest. "Override the computer. Use the ground terminal." "I can't, Miss Blake," Vance shouted back over the deafening roar outside. "The software has initiated an automated safety cascade lock. It thinks the pilot is failing, so it shut down manual control. If the code is locked from the inside, there's nothing anyone on Earth can do. We have less than 15 seconds before it impacts." Sophia screamed, burying her face into her hands, while little Hannah huddled tightly against the corner booth. Wyatt didn't freeze. While everyone else in the room panicked, his entire demeanor went completely steady, his mind operating at a speed that left the chaos behind. He stepped forward, reached out, and forcefully ripped the communication handset right off Vance's tactical vest. He didn't yell into the microphone. He spoke with a chilling, absolute authority that cut through the pilot's screaming over the airwaves. "Vanguard 2, this is Wyatt Carter," he said, his voice an unshakable anchor. "Cease manual fighting on the cyclic immediately. You are feeding data into a corrupted loop. Execute a hard manual reset on the secondary auxiliary bus right now." Through the radio, the pilot's voice was pure panic. "Who is this? The system isn't responding. We're at 40 feet. We're going to crash." "I am the man who wrote the nervous system of the machine you are flying, Captain," Wyatt said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, commanding resonance. "If you want to see tomorrow, flip the auxiliary bus switch and input override code Alpha 907 Echo. Do it now." The seconds that followed stretched into an agonizing, breathless silence inside the diner. punctuated only by the savage screaming of the helicopter's failing turbine outside. Through the cracked glass of the front windows, the blinding beam of the aircraft's spotlight whipped erratically across the gravel lot, illuminating the terror-stricken faces of the people inside. The tail rotor swerved within inches of the main power transformer, sparking a brilliant, violent shower of blue electricity into the dark night. On the radio handset, there was a deafening burst of static, followed by the frantic, heavy breathing of the pilot. "I've flipped the auxiliary bus switch. Inputting the override code now. Alpha, Niner, 7, Echo. God, please let this work." For 3 agonizing beats, the helicopter seemed to completely lose all lift. It dropped like a stone, falling toward the black asphalt. Alexandra let out a sharp, strangled gasp, burying her face into her hands as she prepared for the catastrophic explosion that would destroy her elite security crew. Then, exactly 15 feet above the ground, the machine's violent spinning abruptly stopped. The automated flight control computers, suddenly flooded with Wyatt's master override commands, instantly purged the corrupted data loop. The heavy twin engines roared back to life with a deep, healthy, synchronized thrum. The nose of the massive Vanguard helicopter leveled out perfectly, its stabilization matrix locking into a flawless, steady hover. Slowly, smoothly, the pilot pulled back on the collective, guiding the aircraft up into the dark sky, away from the dangerous power lines and safely above the tree line. Inside the handset, the pilot's voice returned, no longer screaming, but shaking with a profound, breathless reverence. "Command. The system just unlocked. Every single control surface is responsive. The automated safety cascade has been completely overridden. Whoever just took over that radio. They didn't just save this bird. They saved our lives." Wyatt didn't say a word. He didn't smile, and he didn't look out the window to admire the miracle he had just performed. With a completely calm, unhurried motion, he handed the tactical radio back to a stunned Marcus Vance. Wyatt turned around, grabbed a clean white cloth from the shelf, and went right back to wiping down the spilled coffee on the counter. Marcus Vance stood frozen, holding the handset as if it were made of glass. His tactical armor, meant to make him look intimidating, suddenly felt heavy and useless. He looked at Wyatt with an expression that bordered on absolute awe. He had served in special operations for over a decade, and he had seen legends under fire, but he had never witnessed a man completely neutralize a multi-million-dollar tech failure with nothing but a few spoken words and absolute mental clarity. Alexandra slowly lowered her hands from her face. Her chest was heaving, her flawless corporate composure entirely demolished. She looked through the window at her hovering helicopter, then looked at the quiet, single father who was currently adjusting a napkin holder on the laminate table. The stark contrast between her immense material wealth and this man's effortless, protective power was staggering. Her billions had brought her to this roadside diner, but his quiet masculinity had kept her entire world from exploding. "Who are you?" Alexandra whispered, her voice completely stripped of its previous arrogance. She stepped forward, her hands trembling so hard she had to grip the edge of a booth to steady herself. Vance said, "He said you designed the Apex, 9 Matrix. That's a classified weapon system. That's a multi-billion-dollar military patent. Why are you running a highway diner in the middle of nowhere?" Wyatt stopped wiping the counter. He didn't look up immediately. Instead, he reached over to the corner booth where little Hannah was sitting, gently patting her dark curls. Hannah looked up at him, her dark eyes completely calm. She wasn't surprised by what her father had done. To her, he was simply Daddy, the man who always made the world safe when it got too loud. "I used to build things for people who wanted to rule the sky, Miss Blake," Wyatt said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant baritone that filled the quiet room. "But then I realized that the things that actually matter can't be built in a laboratory. They don't require patents, and they certainly don't require your permission." Before Alexandra could formulate a response, the tactical terminal strapped to Vance's wrist began to buzz violently. A bright, pulsing red light flashed across the digital screen, accompanied by an urgent, high-frequency alarm. Vance looked down at the display, and his face went entirely pale for the second time that night. He looked up at Alexandra, his voice dropping into a tense, worried whisper. "Miss Blake, we have a major situation." The moment Commander Carter entered his master override code into our helicopter's system, it didn't just save the aircraft. That specific code is hardwired into the global defense network. It just triggered a Level 1 priority alpha alert at our corporate headquarters in Chicago. Alexandra blinked, a sudden wave of corporate panic rushing back into her eyes. "What does that mean, Vance?" "It means," Vance said, staring at the flashing red terminal, "the automated tracking systems have just flagged the exact location of the missing chief architect. The board of directors, the Pentagon Oversight Committee, and your primary defense investors have just been notified that Wyatt Carter is alive. And right now, 3 high-speed corporate transport jets have just changed their flight paths. They are all heading directly toward the Blackwood Ridge private airstrip across the highway." The rumble of the approaching corporate jets was a low, rolling thunder that vibrated through the foundation of the diner, rattling the metal napkin holders and causes the remaining coffee in the glass carafes to ripple. Across the 2-lane asphalt of Route 9, the abandoned, dark runway of the Blackwood Ridge private airstrip suddenly flooded with brilliant, high-intensity landing lights, cutting through the heavy mist like twin rows of diamonds. Inside the diner, the regular customers Dale, the retired highway inspector, and Carol, the night shift nurse, sat frozen in their booths, their eyes wide as they witnessed the surreal escalation unfolding in their quiet town. Officer Hendricks had quietly slid his handcuffs back into his belt loop, stepping completely away from Wyatt, while Officer Torres stood near the kitchen doors, his chest rising and falling in silent anticipation. Alexandra Blake's smartphone began to vibrate violently in her hand. The screen flashed with an encrypted corporate caller ID, Chairman of the Board. Her fingers trembled slightly as she swiped the screen and brought the phone to her ear, her voice trying desperately to reclaim its cold corporate armor. "Arthur, I am currently in the field securing Sophia. There's been a minor security complication with an uncooperative local, but my detail has the situation under control." "Alexandra, shut up and listen to me." A sharp, panicked voice boomed through the receiver, loud enough for the quiet diner to hear. Arthur Pendleton, the billionaire chairman of the Apex Global Board of Directors, sounded completely breathless. "What did you do? Our global defense mainframe just lit up like a Christmas tree. A master encryption protocol that hasn't been touched in 6 years was activated from a coordinate in Blackwood Ridge. Did you confront Wyatt Carter?" Alexandra's voice caught in her throat. She looked up at Wyatt, who was calmly wrapping a leftover blueberry pie in cellophane, entirely unbothered by her presence. "Arthur, he is a short-order cook. He runs a failing highway diner. He is the sole owner of the proprietary source patents for every automated guidance system we sell to the Pentagon," Pendleton shouted over the line. "If he revokes our licensing agreement because of whatever arrogance you just displayed, Apex Global goes bankrupt by the time the stock market opens at 9 a.m. The board is already landing. Do not move. Do not breathe. Do not say another word to him until we get there." The call went dead. Alexandra slowly lowered the phone, her face draining of all color. She looked around the room, realizing that the entire power dynamic of her universe had just collapsed inside a 24-hour restaurant. 10 minutes later, the gravel lot outside groaned under the weight of 5 armored black luxury sedans, completely boxing in the local police cruiser and the security SUVs. The doors flew open, and a contingent of men in tailored 3-piece suits hurried toward the diner entrance, shielded from the rain by large black umbrellas. Leading the group was Arthur Pendleton himself, alongside a tall, imposing man in a crisp military uniform adorned with multiple stars, Major General Charles Sterling of the United States Air Force. The heavy front door swung wide, the bell clanging frantically. Arthur Pendleton stepped onto the tile floor, his eyes instantly scanning the room until they landed on the man behind the counter. He completely bypassed Alexandra, ignoring her outstretched hand as she tried to step forward. "Commander Carter," Major General Sterling said, his deep, authoritative voice echoing through the diner as he stepped forward and pulled off his military cap. He didn't look at the faded apron or the calloused hands. He looked straight into Wyatt's eyes and delivered a crisp, deeply respectful military salute. 6 years, sir. We thought we lost you to the wind after the accident." Wyatt slowly lowered his cleaning cloth. His expression remained perfectly neutral, quietly masculine, and completely unshakable. "General Sterling. Arthur. You're tracking mud onto my clean floor." The regular customers gasped in unison. Dale lowered his coffee mug, staring at Wyatt as if he were looking at a ghost. The quiet man who had cooked their eggs and kept their coffee hot for 3 years was being saluted by a 2-star general and a billionaire chairman. Alexandra stepped into the center of the floor, her voice desperate, her trembling hands tightly gripping her designer bag. "Arthur, General, please look at the reality of the situation. Literally 1. This man harbored my runaway daughter overnight. He threatened our security detail. Surely his past military record doesn't excuse. Alexandra, your ignorance has just compromised this entire corporation. Arthur Pendleton turned on her, his voice cutting her down with a brutal public finality. 6 years ago, when Wyatt Carter walked away from the aerospace industry after his wife's passing, he didn't sell his patents to Apex Global. He granted us a conditional, revocable lease to use his automated stabilization code under one strict legal covenant, that he would never be disturbed, and that his identity would remain entirely classified. Pendleton opened a sleek, leather-bound portfolio carried by his assistant, pulling out a legal document bearing the official corporate seal. By violating his privacy and attempting to use local law enforcement to intimidate him, Pendleton continued, looking at her with absolute disdain. You have triggered the automatic breach clause of the Apex 9 defense contract. As of exactly 5 minutes ago, the board of directors has voted unanimously. You are officially removed from your position as Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global Aerospace, pending a full federal investigation into your abuse of corporate authority. The words hit Alexandra like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her breath hitching as she looked at the faces of her board members, all of them refusing to meet her gaze. The power, the status, the multi-billion-dollar empire she had built her entire identity around was completely gone. Stripped away in a matter of seconds, inside the very room she had looked down upon with such disgust. Sophia sat on the counter stool, a slow, genuine sense of relief washing over her face as she looked at her mother's defeated posture. She tightened her hold on Hannah's stuffed rabbit, realizing that the suffocating prison of her childhood had just broken wide open. Major General Sterling stepped closer to the counter, placing his hands flat against the laminate surface, his private expression turning deeply earnest. Commander Carter, Wyatt, the Pentagon needs you. The new experimental stealth prototypes are experiencing severe aerodynamic instability at hypersonic speeds. The software engineers can't solve it. Only the man who wrote the original code can stabilize the fleet. Name your price. Any laboratory, any amount of funding, anywhere in the world. The entire room went completely silent, everyone waiting with bated breath for the single father's answer. Wyatt looked at the general, then his gaze drifted to the corner booth where little Hannah was quietly coloring her math worksheet, completely unfazed by the billionaires and generals filling her home. Wyatt reached up, slowly untied the strings of his faded apron, and lifted it over his head, setting it neatly on the counter. He looked straight at General Sterling, his voice dropping into a calm, definitive tone. I don't have a price, General, Wyatt said softly. But I do have conditions. Major General Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. He stood at absolute attention, his decorated uniform contrasting sharply with the worn wooden counter of the highway diner. Name them, Commander. The United States Air Force will grant whatever you require. Wyatt leaned back slightly, his eyes moving over the powerful men occupying his small, humble restaurant. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm, unshakable weight of a man who knew exactly what his principles were worth. First, Wyatt said, pointing a calloused finger toward Sophia, who was still holding tightly to Hannah's stuffed rabbit. Sophia's quarterly schedules, her approved contact lists, and the corporate surveillance stop today. She is a child, not a marketing asset for Apex Global. She will be enrolled in a normal school, and a court-appointed independent advocate will oversee her custody to ensure she chooses her own path. If I see her running through a rainstorm on Route 9 ever again, I will personally revoke your software licenses before the sun sets. Arthur Pendleton nodded frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. Consider it done, Wyatt. The board will legally mandate a trust and an independent guardian immediately. We will strip any corporate exploitation from her lifestyle entirely. Second, Wyatt continued, his gaze finally shifting toward Alexandra Blake. The disgraced billionaire was sitting on the edge of a vinyl booth, her hands trembling in her lap. The corporate mask she had spent decades perfecting had been completely stripped away, leaving her looking fragile and remarkably human. She looked up at Wyatt, her throat tightening as she braced herself for his final vengeance. She expected him to demand her total financial ruin, to banish her from her daughter's life completely, or to humiliate her further in front of the authorities. Instead, Wyatt looked at her with a quiet, profound empathy that caught her completely off guard. Miss Blake will not be cast out of her daughter's life, Wyatt said softly, his voice filling the quiet diner with a warm, unexpected resonance. But she will step down from all operational duties at Apex Global. She needs to stop managing an empire and learn how to be a mother. She will attend mandatory family counseling with Sophia, away from the cameras, away from the boardrooms, and away from the press. Alexandra gasped, a sudden, heavy sob escaping her throat. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. It was a rare, genuine moment of pure vulnerability. For years, she had believed that money and power were the only shields capable of protecting her family from the harsh realities of the world. But standing in this dim diner, watching this humble, single father protect her daughter's emotional well-being while refusing to destroy her own, she finally understood what real strength looked like. She had everything in the world, yet she had never known a single moment of the absolute peace this man provided without even trying. "Thank you," Alexandra whispered through her tears, her voice entirely stripped of its former coldness. She looked at Wyatt, her eyes shining with a deep, breathless admiration that she had never felt for any man before. The sudden, intense emotional chemistry between them hung in the quiet air, a subtle but powerful tension born from shared pain and newfound respect. "And my final condition, General," Wyatt said, turning back to Sterling. "I am not leaving Blackwood Ridge, I will not return to a military laboratory, and I will not leave my daughter. If you want me to stabilize your hypersonic prototypes, you will deliver a secure mainframe terminal to the private hangar across the highway. I will rewrite the flight control code from here, on my own time, between my diner shifts." General Sterling let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh of relief. He extended his hand across the counter. "You have a deal, Commander Carter. The secure terminal will be installed by dawn." Wyatt shook the general's hand with a firm, decisive grip. As the high-ranking officials and board members began to file out of the diner to finalize the paperwork in their armored vehicles, the heavy atmosphere in the room finally began to lift. The rain outside had stopped completely, leaving the gravel parking lot glistening under the pale morning light breaking through the clouds. Sophia stood up from the counter stool, walking over to the corner booth where little Hannah was waiting. She gently placed the stuffed rabbit back into the little girl's arms, kneeling down to meet her eye level. "Thank you, Hannah," Sophia said, a bright, beautiful smile completely transforming her face. Carrot really did keep the dark from being too loud. "He always does," Hannah smiled back, hugging the rabbit tight. "You can come back and eat pancakes with us whenever you want." Sophia looked up at Wyatt, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, for everything." "Anytime, kiddo," Wyatt said, offering her a warm, protective smile. Alexandra walked slowly toward the diner exit, pausing just before the doorway. She turned back to look at Wyatt, her hands no longer shaking, though her eyes remained deeply soft. The arrogant, ruthless executive was gone, replaced by a woman who had just been given a second chance at saving her relationship with her child. "Wyatt," Alexandra said quietly, using his first name for the very first time. "I don't even know how to begin fixing the mistakes I've made. I've spent so long building walls that I forgot how to look over them." Wyatt picked up a fresh pot of coffee, looking at her with a calm, grounded reassurance. "The hardest part isn't building the door, Miss Blake. It's choosing to walk through it. You've already taken the first step." Alexandra stared at him for a long, silent moment, the unsaid words between them stretching into a heavy, dramatic pause. A fragile, hopeful future seemed to flash between them before she turned and walked out into the morning air, following her daughter toward the waiting vehicle. Wyatt watched the black SUVs slowly pull out of the gravel lot, their tires crunching against the wet stones as they departed toward the highway. The diner was quiet once more, the familiar hum of the refrigerators returning to fill the space. He walked over to Hannah's booth, sliding into the vinyl seat across from his daughter. He looked down at her half-finished math worksheet, a quiet, peaceful smile finally reaching his eyes. "Ready to finish those fractions, sweetheart?" Wyatt asked. Before Hannah could answer, the sudden, frantic ringing of the diner's landline telephone erupted from the wall behind the counter. It wasn't a normal ring. It was the high-priority, secure red line that hadn't buzzed since Wyatt walked away from the military 6 years ago. Wyatt's smile vanished. He stood up slowly, walked over to the wall, and lifted the receiver to his ear. "Carter," he said quietly. A voice on the other end, frantic and distorted by heavy encryption static, spoke 5 words that made the blood in Wyatt's veins turn completely to ice. The static on the encrypted line crackled once more, a sharp, cold sound that seemed to freeze the very air inside the diner. The voice on the other end belonged to a deep-level contact within the Defense Intelligence Agency, an old brother-in-arms who had spent 6 years monitoring the digital shadows for Wyatt. "The ledger is completely unsealed. The voice repeated, trembling with a mixture of awe and urgency. Wyatt, the master override code you just fed into the Apex mainframe didn't just save that helicopter. It bypassed the secure corporate vault. The offshore transaction records from 6 years ago just decrypted. The reckless driver who ran the red light and took Julia from you, he didn't just sleep through a brake line. He received a $3 million wire transfer 48 hours prior. It came from a shell corporation controlled directly by Arthur Pendleton. Wyatt didn't drop the phone. He didn't scream, and his face did not twist into an expression of wild fury. Instead, his entire countenance went perfectly, terrifyingly still. The quiet masculinity that defined him solidified into an unshakable, absolute gravity. He slowly lowered the receiver, his eyes tracking through the wide glass windows of the diner. Outside, across the damp gravel lot, Arthur Pendleton was smiling. The billionaire chairman was adjusting his expensive silk tie, preparing to step into the backseat of his armored luxury sedan, completely convinced he had just secured a multi-billion-dollar military contract and reeled a legendary engineer back into his corporate web. Wyatt reached over to his wrist, his thumb pressing a precise sequence of buttons on the side of his titanium Omega Speedmaster. The watch emitted a low, sub-audible digital tone. Instantly, a sharp, metallic sound echoed across the parking lot. The heavy, reinforced doors of Pendleton's armored sedan violently slammed shut on their own. The electronic deadbolts engaged with a deafening click. The engine died instantly, and the vehicle's high-security, bulletproof windows rolled up tightly, sealing the billionaire chairman inside his own high-tech cage. The digital dashboard of the vehicle flashed a bright, pulsing crimson, displaying a single command: System Lockdown. Arthur Pendleton gasped, violently throwing his weight against the passenger door, his face twisting into instant panic as he realized he was completely trapped. Major General Sterling turned around sharply, his hand instinctively dropping toward his sidearm. Marcus Vance and his tactical security team immediately raised their weapons, scanning the perimeter for a threat. The heavy front door of the diner swung open, the bell clanging clearly in the morning air. Wyatt Carter walked out onto the gravel. He had thrown his stained apron over the counter, standing now in his simple gray work shirt and work boots. Yet he carried an aura of absolute command that made every armed soldier in the lot instantly lower their barrels. "Stand down, General," Wyatt said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that carried effortlessly across the open lot. He walked forward, his boots crunching deliberately against the whetstones until he stood directly in front of Pendleton's trapped sedan. "Wyatt, what is the meaning of this?" General Sterling demanded, stepping forward with his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Why have you locked down the chairman's transport?" 6 years ago, everyone believed I walked away from the military-industrial complex because I was a broken man mourning his wife, Wyatt said, his eyes locking onto Pendleton through the dark-tinted glass of the vehicle. "They thought I bare-hoo myself in a roadside diner to hide from the world. But I am an aerospace engineer, General. I don't run from broken systems. I build solutions for them." Wyatt tapped the screen of his watch, activating the vehicle's external communication system, so Pendleton's voice could be heard by everyone in the lot. "Arthur thought he was clever," Wyatt continued, his voice entirely devoid of pity. "He wanted my automated guidance patents, but I refused to sell them to a man who viewed human lives as collateral damage. So, he engineered a tragic accident on a rain-slicked highway to force my estate into probate. He thought he broke me, but I knew the truth. I just needed the absolute proof, and the only way to get it was to force Apex Global to bring their highest-level corporate encryption keys directly to my doorstep." Arthur Pendleton's frantic, sweat-drenched face pressed against the glass, his voice echoing through the external speakers in a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "You're insane, Carter. You have no proof. You're a line cook. General, arrest this man. He's committing a federal offense. The master override code I used to save your helicopter, Arthur, wasn't just a safety patch," Wyatt said softly. "It was a forensic digital worm. Right now, a complete copy of your encrypted offshore banking ledger, including the wire transfers to the driver who struck my wife's vehicle, has just been uploaded directly to the Pentagon Oversight Committee and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The entire parking lot went dead silent. Inside the diner, Dale and Carol watched with open mouths, their hands pressed against the glass. Major General Sterling's face turned into a mask of pure, unadulterated military steel. He turned his gaze slowly toward the trapped vehicle, his chest heaving with a profound, righteous fury. He looked at his military police officers and gave a single definitive nod. Officers Hendricks, Torres. "Break that glass," General Sterling commanded, his voice cold enough to split wood. "Arthur Pendleton, you are under arrest for corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, and treason against the United States. Secure him immediately." Torres and Hendricks moved forward with absolute purpose. Their previous deference to corporate wealth completely evaporated. Within minutes, the billionaire chairman was dragged out of his luxury vehicle in handcuffs, his expensive suit covered in gravel dust as he was publicly humiliated in front of his entire board of directors, his security detail, and the local townspeople. Alexandra Blake stood near the edge of the lot, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. The profound weight of the revelation shattered what little remained of her former corporate world. She looked at Wyatt, her heart aching with a deep, consuming mixture of intense guilt and overwhelming admiration. This man had carried the weight of a shattered universe for 6 years, living in humility to protect his daughter and secure absolute justice for his wife, yet he had still found the grace to save her own child from an emotional collapse. She walked slowly toward him, her steps hesitant, her proud posture completely softened into something genuine, vulnerable, and deeply moving. "Wyatt," Alexandra whispered, her voice trembling as she stood in front of him, the space between them charged with an undeniable, powerful emotional chemistry. "I am so sorry. I spent years serving a monster, thinking I was building a legacy for my daughter. I don't even deserve your mercy." Wyatt looked down at her, his steady blue eyes holding no hatred, only a calm, protective warmth. "You didn't know, Alexandra. You were trapped in a system built on leverage. But the system is gone now. You have a daughter who needs her mother. Go build something real with her." Alexandra stared up at him, a fragile, hopeful smile breaking through her tears. The intense connection between them hung in the quiet morning air, a silent promise that this roadside diner would not be the end of their story, but perhaps the beginning of a completely redefined future. From the doorway of the diner, little Hannah walked out into the warm, golden rays of the morning sun. She was still holding her tattered, stuffed rabbit, Carrot, by the ear, her dark curls bouncing as she walked straight to her father's side. She slipped her small hand into Wyatt's calloused palm, looking up at the sky as the dark storm clouds finally scattered completely, revealing a brilliant, endless blue. "Daddy," Hannah said softly, her voice carrying the pure, comforting certainty of a child who knew she was completely safe. "Is the loud part over?" Wyatt slowly knelt down, lifting his daughter effortlessly into his strong arms and pressing a tender kiss against her forehead. He looked out over the quiet highway, his chest expanding with a profound, final sense of absolute peace. The debt had been paid, justice had been delivered, and his home remained exactly what he had built it to be, a refuge. "Yeah, sweetheart," Wyatt whispered, his voice steady, grounded, and filled with hope. "The loud part is completely over. Let's go make some pancakes." He turned back toward the entrance of Carter's diner, his hand resting gently against his daughter's back as the neon sign above the door buzzed cleanly in the morning light, welcoming whatever the open road decided to bring next.